Good morning. I'm Sarah Serafini. I'm excited to welcome you to our very first SPA Spotlight webinar session in our series. As we all know, our world is rapidly evolving, and we know that there's challenges, but they have a way of opening doors into creativity, ingenuity, and innovation. So the Suncoast Student Production Awards is committed to recognizing outstanding student achievement, and we believe our mission extends to also providing support and opportunities for personal and professional development as our students look forward to a bright and successful future in our industry. So the idea for these webinar series emerged as the Student Production Awards Committee identified the need to help prepare college and high school seniors for a future in our industry. So this will be the first of many useful and constructive conversations we're offering our students, and we're confident that this will be a valuable addition to the education that you're receiving, whether you're remote school or you're back in school right now. But I want to thank our distinguished guests for joining and generously sharing their knowledge and expertise. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our moderator, the Chair of Journalism and Media Management and Associate Professor of Media Law and Ethics at the University of Miami, Sam Torelli. And I would also like to introduce Gina Presson, who's the lecturer in broadcast journalism and writing at the University of Miami and former reporter and producer at WEDU Tampa. So Gina today will be fielding the questions from our audience. So I do ask all students to please include your full name, your school, and your question. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Sam to introduce our panel.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you very much. And I'd like to thank all of the people at Suncoast who have made this program possible. We have a wonderful panel for you. As Sarah mentioned, I chair the Department of Journalism and Media Management at the University of Miami. And I perhaps have a somewhat different perspective on some issues because I've spent practically my entire professional life as a media lawyer. So I've seen the media at both its best and its worst. And there's really nothing more important than media ethics and awareness by journalists and student journalists of what the issues are. Very often there aren't real clear answers, but if we don't consider the issues and we don't consider the impact of what we're doing, then we've lost an opportunity to really do our jobs well. We'll be discussing many of those issues today. Let me get all of the panelists on board and then give each of them a chance to talk a bit more about themselves and their perspectives. And we'll start with Miriam Masihi, whose last name I've practiced a few times. Miriam is an absolutely wonderful consumer reporter with Telemundo 51 and NBC6 here in Miami. Let me also introduce Willard Shepard. Many of you know Willard. Willard is an investigative reporter with NBC6, also here in Miami. I've known Willard for many years. I'm also pleased to say Willard has a family connection to another UM that's dear to my heart, the University of Michigan, where I went to law school. Terrence Shepard, who is the news director at WLRN Public Media. Terrence and I were colleagues at the Miami Herald so many years ago. I think we were probably both children at the time, must have been. And then finally, Mr. Ethics himself, Bob Steele, who's a director and professor at the Institute for Ethics. His bio goes on for so long, we'd be here for another 30 minutes. Bob is the person I would go to read and see what he thought whenever I was faced with a particularly difficult issue in whatever role I happened to be playing at that time in my life. So with that quick introduction, let's go to the panelists each individually, starting with Miriam.
Thanks so much, Sam. I love seeing everybody bright and early this Saturday morning. I first want to thank, obviously, the Suncoast chapter of NATAS, always finding ways to give it back to the community, taking an interest in our young journalists that are going to shape the future of our industry. So that's something we are all looking forward to. Like Sam said, I'm the consumer investigative reporter for Telemundo 51 and NBC6. I help solve the issues of our community, our viewers. It's a really rewarding job. I really encourage the young journalists to start looking into consumer investigations. I do believe that is a big part of the future of this industry to make sure that we don't forget our community. So far, our unit's been able to recover over $2 million in money, services, and products, and we really are excited about that. And today I'm interested in hearing their concerns, these young journalists that are teaching us, like Willard always says, we learn from them, and we're going to try to give you guys a little bit of our experience. This industry is going through some major changes, and we're trying to keep up with them while maintaining our journalistic ethics and standards. So that's the trick here. It's very fast paced now, it's changing medium, but still, remains important. Our journalistic ethics and standards remain really important, especially in times like now. So I'm looking forward to hearing from our panelists and also from our students, your questions.
Thank you, Miriam. Willard, what would you like to add to your background, illustrious as it is?
Oh, well, that's well overstated. I'd like to thank everyone for inviting me this morning, for you for hosting, to my good friend Miriam there. I always try to learn from Miriam. Miriam's one of the finest journalists I know, and I feel proud to be able to have a chance to work with her and learn from everything that she does on the air and off the air every day. So I'm interested to hear from everyone, Terrence and Mr. Steele, to try to capture as much as we can about what is, I think, the most important time in journalism in our country because of what has transpired. And I would encourage all the young people, Sam, you mentioned some about your background, about having different things that we're able to do and bring to the table. You being an attorney, I'm also a member of the Florida Bar. And then I spent many years of my life, 28 years worth, Air Force flying fighters and those things. So I believe that having a different area of expertise, especially when it comes to law enforcement and the military and the law and small businesses, whatever our students out there are interested in doing outside specifically of journalism, I want to encourage them to do those things, because diversity is so important in our newsrooms today. When we think about diversity, many times we only think about ethnic diversity, but in diversity, when it comes to business, industry, all of these things is more important now than ever, so that we can be fair, we can be balanced, and we can do what we're doing ethically now, which is more important than ever, because everyone is aware that our industry in many regards is under attack about not being fair. And therefore, our standards have to be the very, very, very best. And I'm looking forward to learning from each of you and our students today.
Thank you, Willard. Terrence, as I mentioned, you and I were colleagues at the Herald, and I've been trying to think back for some time to any of your stories that I may have cleared as counsel, and anything I may have done back then, I apologize for right now. So, Terrence, to your background.
No apologies, Sam, because Sam always made the stories better from an editorial perspective and better long-term, because they can get sued. And so thanks for your work, Sam.
You're welcome.
So I'm news director at WLRN, the public media station for South Florida. I'm also the past chairman of the Radio Television Digital News Association. And that's the largest trade association for broadcast and digital journalists in the world. Before I became chair and past chair, I was the ethics chair, which is not an enviable position because you're always pointing out ways to do things better. It's a lot of vegetables, not a lot of steak and potatoes, but this is the stuff that will help you in your career. If you want to get to be like Willard or Miriam, you're going to have to get these fundamentals down, and you might as well get them down now. You hear people talk about biases. Well, I am biased. I'm biased toward the truth. I'm biased toward accuracy. I'm biased toward fairness. I'm biased toward context. Those are some of the pillars that you need to get down pat if you want to find success in this business. So those are some of the things you'll hear from me today. But also, I learn a lot from students because it tells me what they're thinking about. You probably are thinking of situations in terms of coverage that I may not have come across because you're younger, probably, maybe. You might be younger than me. And so I'm always open to learning. My grandmother used to say, if you're done learning, you're done. So please, I'm looking forward to learning from the panelists and from the students joining in. And thank you to Suncoast.
Thank you, Terrence. I really wasn't kidding when I referred to Bob as Mr. Ethics. I remember, and I have, I think, 2 copies of his book, Doing Ethics in Journalism, in my office at UM. And we're particularly grateful to Bob for joining us, because you may not realize, even though there appears to be some sunlight in the back of his room, he's in Colorado, where everything is, of course, 2 hours earlier. Bob, please join in.
Well, thank you, Sam, and good morning, everyone. And it's a pleasure to join you and Miriam, Willard, and Terrence with the students in Florida in this conversation this morning. I've had the good fortune to work with thousands of journalists and hundreds of news organizations across the country. And I can say that those journalists are best prepared when it comes to ethical issues, when they've thought ahead about what those issues would be, and they deal with the issues before they become problems. Journalism ethics is really not just about the standards and practices of what guides us in journalism. It is also very much about ethical decision making. It's about the skill of anticipating, recognizing where there are ethical pressure points, and being prepared to deal with them in the best way possible. That's what allows us to seek excellence in the work we do as journalists. And I look forward to hearing the thoughts and questions of the high school and college journalists this morning to deal with these particular issues in a meaningful way. So it's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you, Bob. Let me give you an idea of how we'll proceed. We have a few issues that we'd like to discuss generally for a bit, while the people attending, the audience, the students and others, send their questions in, and then Gina will get those questions to me. So we'll have plenty of time, and we welcome your questions. I feel the way the others do. I always learn from the students in my class. I'll raise an issue, and then they'll tell me something new that's on YouTube or the internet that I'd never heard of. I'm fascinated with these new issues, so please jump in. But I'll tell you where I'd like to begin. Whether you're a student journalist or you're a professional journalist right now, and Willard alluded to the fact that journalism is somewhat under attack. And well, it's always been somewhat under attack, although the level, the volume level of that attack seems to have ramped up significantly, say in the last 4 or 5 years. But one of those issues and is how should young journalists do? What should they do if they're accused of being the enemy of the people and purveyors of fake news? A term I'm not terribly fond of, fake news, but how should journalists address that issue today whenever somebody doesn't agree with reporting, even if there's a concerted effort to observe the biases that Terrence talked about, being biased in favor of accuracy, truth, reporting, fact, etc., that the people who don't like it simply shout out, "Oh, fake news, you're the enemy of the people." How would you all deal with that now? And I think what I'll do is I'll start up with Miriam, because you report on things that have a real direct impact on local people, everyday people, and sure, the people you're helping are thrilled, but perhaps the people you're covering are not. And then once Miriam talks, let's all jump in and have a conversation.
Yeah, I think now more than ever, I mean, for me, ethics is about being fair, and being fair is about trying to get every side and trying to get your facts straight. And I think now more than ever, that's so important. I can tell you a bunch of examples where I've done stories that have not cast a particularly great light on somebody, but then I've reported in their light so fair that they've contacted me with their problems later. You know, I had the owner of a supermarket chain that we found out they were selling, you know, these are consumer stories, skinless chicken, skin on chicken. They would hide the skin underneath and sell it for skinless prices. And I was after that gentleman for weeks trying to get him to talk to me, and I couldn't get through. And I said, you know what? It is so important to get through. I figured out one day he's going to be in his office, and I went and I sat down at his office and I said, I'll wait for him. And he gave me an interview. He fixed the issue. And even though it wasn't such a great story for him, when he had an issue, he thought I was so fair. He contacted me with his problem. So it is important to always try to get the other side. And right now it's difficult sometimes because of the stigma that a lot of people are perpetrating about journalists, that, they don't want the other side. They're this, they're that. I think it's more important than ever to get the other side. And sometimes the other side doesn't have to be, they gave me a statement or they talked to me. Sometimes the other side is they spoke on record in a court document in a similar case, in a police report, in another interview. And, you know what they believe or what they've said on the record, and you can include that in your reporting. And I think that's how we manage being fair, when sometimes it's not easy to get the other side. But being fair will always open doors for you. And, the people that, are accused of things by our viewers, I make sure first to document, to make sure that these accusations or these allegations are well documented. I don't just go with what people are telling you. You want to ask the person who's contacting you, hey, what are they going to say about you? Are they going to say you're a disgruntled employee? You want to make sure that you also look at that person. And then you want to be as fair as possible and find the other side and give people time to respond. I think, I see all the time, and I know the industry is very fast paced. We reached out to so-and-so and didn't hear back, but they reached out to so-and-so like 30 minutes ago. And that's not really being fair. And we can talk about some ambush interviews later, and that'll be a whole other conversation. And we have a lot of legal experts on the panel that can talk about that. But I think right now, for you to be, you can't help what people believe. You really cannot help what people believe. People are looking to find a bias, but people should not see your story and blatantly notice, your bias. And they should not. You should be able to see both sides. I'm not saying hide the truth. I think you need to cross your T's and dot your I's more than ever nowadays, but you can't control what people think. And that's what you can control is what you put out and how fair, is your reporting. So that's my advice. I mean, double down on being fair and getting all the sides. It's more important now than ever, I think.
Willard, go ahead, Terrence.
When you hear that we're the enemy of the people, we're biased, we're scumbags, that's important to remember when you're in the field reporting, because when you're in the field, you could become the subject of an attack, a physical attack, much less name calling. So I recommend reporters, when you go in the field, make sure you have at least one other person with you. Make sure you can see everything that's happening. I'm speaking mostly about rallies and protests, the things that we've seen in the past few months. You don't ever want to be surprised by anything. So you always want to be able to see everything, you and your buddy in the field, because people have been, and RTDNA has pointed out many places where people attack journalists physically, not just because they're upset with the story, but they'll physically punch journalists, be it because they're even journalists, because they're wearing a mask. So you need to keep your safety in mind first. If you see anything that looks suspicious, get the heck out of there, because nothing is worth risking your life or getting injured.
Okay, Sam, I wanted to follow up on what Terrence and Miriam were speaking about there. And we've talked some in theory. I want to lay out a couple of real world points. Number one, during our gubernatorial election, which was very close, and this shows our students and all of us who are doing this now as a living, that this is the reality that we live in now. It's not just in theory. I was at the Broward County Elections headquarters. We were doing some live broadcast. There were protesters there from the Republican and the Democratic Party, as these were tight races. And we were on the air live, and a person from the Republican delegation that was there came up and began yelling enemy of the people, enemy of the state, enemy of all of this while I was on the air with profanity and a lot of other things. I had to do a legal disclaimer on the air to absolve NBC and all of its platforms for anything anybody heard. That certainly was not our position, but it bordered on what Terrence spoke about, a physical altercation. One of the people that was there at this event is also the woman who is the administrative officer for the United States Boxing Association here in South Florida and does the administrative paperwork. I happen to be a master boxer and participate in the competitions. The woman saw what was taking place, and she's a large supporter of our president, and quickly dispatched a couple of individuals to grab the person that was close to me that appeared to be about to enter a physical confrontation with me. And certainly I don't in any way that type of thing to be on television or any of us subjected to. But she quickly dispatched them to grab him and said, that guy you don't want to get into it with. And it's a sense of a real world situation about the danger that does exist, and we all need to be careful.
I want to add something to that, Willard. I think that part of it is because she recognized maybe the guy was going to get his kicked, but also because you have earned the respect of the community. Willard is part of the community, and I think that's a very important thing. People know Willard outside of our industry, volunteering, serving the community, and he has gained the respect. So while one person may yell at him, there are a lot of people in that audience that have seen Willard be fair for, I'm not going to say how many years, because he looks younger than I am, but he's older than I am. Just going to put that on the record. But there are people that will go in and say, no, Willard is not like that, and will vouch for you even in those settings. So I think that's the importance of, when we're going to talk about that a little bit later, your brand. Willard's brand is he is fair. And while right now a couple of people may, this station is this and this station is that, they're like, no, but that's Willard Shepard, and he's fair and he's straightforward and he's part of our community. So I think more than that she recognized you, and that's just my personal belief, that because you're a boxer, because Willard has like 100 hats, I think she recognized, listen, that's Willard Shepard, and he's not out here trying to do anything. And
well, the other factor of this, and that's why I spoke at the beginning about our young people and all of us doing different things with our lives and bringing this to the table. Since you mentioned that, and I wasn't going to speak about that part of it, there were some people that were veterans in the group, and they also grabbed the guy and said, the person you're yelling at, was the guy over Iraq in the jet. So of all the people that you yell at, an enemy of the state, we're going to give you a beat down because of you yelling at him for that. And I think that there's just this misperception, sadly, that has been marketed that those of us who are journalists are not community servants, which is completely untrue, and doing our best, especially in this pandemic that we're in, to provide this information. And therefore, our mission is to do it to the very best in terms of our ethics and all that we do, so that we don't leave any stone unturned that someone can legitimately criticize us. And I just hope we reach a day where our community recognizes that service.
Bob, what's your view on this?
I'll just agree very much with the notion that journalists are not the enemy of the people. Journalists serve a very specific role in our society. Journalists are unique in that role. No other professionals play the same role that journalists do. Teachers and physicians and lawyers and insurance agents and nurses and all others play important roles in our society, but nobody plays the essential, unique role that journalists do. And it's important to bring who we are in terms of our knowledge and our skills to the table in that work. I was fortunate to start in journalism many years ago in my high school at a small town in the Midwest where we had a radio station where I started reporting, and then I continued in college And like Willard, I am also a military veteran. I served as an Army officer in Vietnam, and I was able to bring that experience and other experiences of my life eventually as a father, now a grandfather, my religious connections, my perspectives on a community, to who I have been as a journalist and the way I see the world. The most important thing I think we can do as a journalist in high school, in college, and throughout our professional career is be very good at the process of ethical decision making, be able to justify that process to ourselves, to others, and to be able to support it and in a legitimate way defend it, not just of what we have decided to do, but how we've decided to make those ethical decisions. What are those standards and practices that we have used in deciding when we would use a confidential source, when we would cover a story in particular ways related to the vulnerability of children, to be able to justify and explain why and how we do what we do.
Good point. Miriam's raised an issue a few minutes ago. She talked about how it's sometimes hard to get the other side to, we don't have the subpoena power, much as I often wished we had. We can't compel people to talk. They can run and perhaps even hide. And Miriam talked about, well, looking for court records, looking for other sources for that information. Bob, how incumbent is it upon journalists to go through that much effort to try to get the other side and understand it, even if they're not willing for whatever reason?
Well, it's a primary obligation. If somebody is accused of wrongdoing, we need to get to that person as very best as possible. Now, almost all stories have multiple sides to them. One of those sides is somebody who's accused of wrongdoing. But the earlier we recognize that obligation and that need to get the other side, the other sides of a story, the better our opportunity to find those individuals. In some cases, we have to bring in a proxy for that individual. If that individual is not available or refuses to talk, there are ways through court records, as you point out, through other voices. It may be an attorney representing somebody. It may be a guardian ad litem in the case of an individual in the system who needs representation, who cannot voice their particular concern. But it's a primary obligation to bring the other sides to the story.
Anyone else on that?
Yeah, Sam, Miriam, go ahead.
No, there's also industry representatives. Say, it's let's say the restaurant, and a restaurant doesn't want to talk, and, you tried, and, the people who I contact, they know I'm going to call them until they talk to me, because I want to get that other side. But sometimes you can't, they just simply shut down, they disappear, they go in hiding or whatever. I think that there's a lot to be said about bringing an industry representative, say the restaurant association will speak on behalf of that restaurant, saying, well, whatever they were thinking when that happened. So I think that there's a lot of ways to find, like Bob says, maybe a proxy for that, somebody who will speak on their behalf.
Yeah, we have to exhaust all means, as I think my emphasis and all of us throughout the course of the day is, we have no room for error. We don't want anyone that's accusing us of being unfair, especially in these times, to give them any ammunition or evidence of that, and have to go through every means possible. After all that's done, and you have to be very careful, and I want to caution our students today in balancing this, is that sometimes you have to physically take action. I'm a person that feels comfortable talking to anybody in any place in any neighborhood. I wouldn't recommend what I'm telling you to certain people who may not have the experience to do it, and certainly not do it alone. But about 3 weeks ago, we're working on a broadcast concerning an alleged abuse of a juvenile who was held in the custody at a state facility. And the correctional officer was terminated. And we were working this story. We had talked to the parents, talked to photographs, but we needed to find this individual. As Miriam talked about, we reached out to him through the union, but he wasn't a member of the union. We reached out to him through the state. We exhausted everything. We had an address through the court records and other things that we had, and he had not a real common name. It wasn't James Smith, but it wasn't some very unusual name either. And I had an address and talked to my producer about this. I went to that address, and we never trespass under any circumstances. I knocked on the door. I put my card in the door, and a woman about 65 years old opened the door. This individual was 40. And I asked for him, and we started a conversation, and she said to me, "What's his birth date?" And when I didn't have the birth date right in front of me, so I made a quick phone call, and my coworker told me his birth date. So when I told him the birth date, the woman looked at me and said, "My son, who is of the same name, died a few days ago." So it was certainly not the one people we were looking for. And after that took my breath away, and I apologized in any way, shape, fashion, and form that I could. I expected a reaction from her that would not have been kind. But surprisingly to me, the woman said, "I admire you for all that you're doing to try to find this person to give their side of what happened here." But for the COVID, I would have given her a big hug and wished her nothing but spirits for her and her family. And so therefore, I relay that to you because going through great lengths, even though we didn't locate the individual, and that wasn't the reaction I expected, it was something that was heartwarming in a sense of doing in our efforts to try to do the right thing, and that they are recognized even by someone who could have, by all rights, I was on their property and could have, done anything they wanted to me in terms of their reaction, especially their circumstances. But that's not the reaction that I got.
That's interesting. Now, let me raise a related question. Sometimes getting the other side of the story is difficult, not just because people don't want to talk, but because it's complicated, difficult to understand. And I'm particularly thinking of some of what Terrence does in terms of business reporting. You can find, volumes and volumes of business related records, securities records, stuff with the SEC, all sorts of filings, Form 990s and 10Ks and so on. Sometimes you're in a very complicated area, and even the litigation can be voluminous and also very complex. How do we help our journalists understand these issues, which sometimes require incredible expertise? Any thoughts on that, Terrence?
So the first thing, whenever you've got a hostile interview situation, say the ones Miriam described, you always want to let the person know that you've got a deadline. In terms of fairness, it's not fair to say, "Hey, Mr. Steele, I need you to interview with me right now. Otherwise, I'm going up with the story that you're a crook." That blows your fairness just out of the way. That's inappropriate. It's unethical. So always give your subject a deadline. Reporters always have these competing interests. You got a news director who wants the story yesterday. But if you can't get the story yesterday, you need to explain to the news director, "Okay, I'm working on getting Mr. Steele to talk to me. I've given him until tomorrow at 4 o'clock. Otherwise, I'm going with X, Y, and Z," that Mr. Steele would not comment. So to Sam's question about dealing with complex stories, and most of life is complex, that also plays into the time element. You always want to take the time to study up what it is that you're reporting on. If you're working on a business, you need to take the time to learn how to read SEC documents. You need to know how to check out state corporation records. So you need to make it a matter of your concern to study the person you're doing a story on. This takes time. It means you're not doing superficial coverage. It means you're digging to find the greater meaning behind the story. So time can be your friend or your enemy, but certainly if you go with a story too quickly, you can do a lot of damage in terms of your subject and your audience. You don't want to give your audience an inappropriate picture of what's going on.
I think that points out how important it is to take into account the power of the media. When you name a person, an entity, portray them in a bad light, that could be devastating for them. Young journalists know how, viral social media gets. And if you put something and they all, like my kid says, we all don't like them, that means all of the media doesn't like that comment. Not to mention a business could lose customers. So you have to make sure to know, the power you have and not take that lightly. When we put something on the air, it could be devastating for a business, especially now during coronavirus. And if you're not sure, you could damage somebody, and that's definitely not, what journalism is about. So that's the importance of giving people time. Listen, we all have news directors who want the story yesterday, like Terrence says, but they also don't want you to get sued. So that's important to mention. So
I want to follow on what Miriam and Terrence are saying there, in the sense of we have to balance what is the story, what is the importance of it, especially on Miriam and my side of it, our side of it, especially now with the immediacy and things changing so rapidly. And we're always, attempting to get the best information on first, that in the competitive environment as well, which adds a factor to this. We have to always take a step back and say, okay, if we do put this on the air, what are the ramifications of doing this? And what impact is it going to have? And at the end of the day, are we talking about something that really is not that relevant? Or are we talking about something of great magnitude? And that really we have to keep in perspective. Sadly, at the Parkland tragedy, I was on the phone with one of my contacts who was standing in the hallway with the school kids who had lost their lives. And this was before we knew what happened. And this person told me how many people had lost their lives. And we stood with my news director and made a decision about, and a conversation about the magnitude of doing that. Could we have broken the story? Yes, but we had great diligence with that and waited. And actually, from the time that conversation ended and the time I walked to this broadcast set, the sheriff had walked out and at that point then delivered that news. And that's why we need to keep all of this in perspective about what is it really that the story's about, that we got to go on TV with that right now, or can we wait?
I think it's an excellent point, and it brings up a point Bob has made about the ethical decision-making process and having the conversation, whether it's with your editor or your producer. Bob?
Yeah, I think that there is a phrase that I've always endorsed, and that's don't do ethics alone. Seek input and guidance from multiple other individuals, your colleagues, your editor, your producer, your executive producer, whomever it might be, so that you can make a better decision. Makes it more challenging when you have more voices in the decision-making process, but it makes it better. Also, I very much endorse the idea of what I've called over the years of seeking input from rabbis. Now, I'm not referring to going to the synagogue or to the temple to get the rabbi, but a rabbi is a wise individual, somebody who has knowledge about a particular subject. I remember as a journalist reporting on the issue of suicide multiple times. And I've had many high school or college journalists call me to say, I'm reporting on multiple suicides among our high schools in our community. or on our college campus? How do I best go about it? Here's a perfect example where the journalist should be seeking input from psychologists, from professional suicidologists, those individuals who study the issue of suicide in a society. Also, the National Institute of Health and others have put forth guidelines for journalists in order to tell the story about suicide, but tell it very carefully, accurately, fairly, respectfully, to get to the truth, but to minimize harm, to be respectful in the process, and to make sure that we honor the vulnerability of certain individuals. But we do report on the issue because it is a public policy issue of great significance, whether it's only in our own community, in our high schools, or whether it's in our larger community or our society. So seeking input from wise individuals to help us make smart, sound decisions.
Hey, Sam, can I follow on one thing Bob mentioned there about seeking but from our professionals? I mean, I send things to people. Miriam's one of my rabbis, so to speak, on a project that she doesn't have anything to do with, so she can put her professional eye on it. But I also believe in asking people who aren't professional journalists. I like leaning on my wife or my son, friends of mine that don't have this skill set and trade set, because at the end of the day, it's not about us through our professional eyes. It's about what they're going to read, what they're going to see. And did it make sense? Wow, if you saw that on television and what you were talking about, a person with a mental health issue or something like that, would it offend you if that was on? Because we're actually doing our best to serve them. And they may see things because we're so wrapped up in it that we don't detect a big picture, like, oh no, don't do that, because that family and those people, it's obviously going to be painful to them, and there's no benefit from that information. We've worked on it so much that we may not see that. And so I would encourage people to ask other individuals that don't have anything to do with this, what their thought process is about if they saw this. And I've found that to be beneficial.
Excellent point. Let me, a couple of you have also mentioned the issue of confidentiality and confidential sources. Bob referred to it. When should a journalist rely or use a confidential source? And I'm specifically thinking of a recent issue that I'm familiar with, and it also raises the question of the particular challenges faced by student journalists. So the Miami Hurricane, the student newspaper at the University of Miami, recently ran a story about fraternities and I believe sororities as well, that were holding parties, some off, some on campus, obviously social distancing, without masks, raising the whole question of COVID. This entire story was based on confidential sources because members of the frats generally don't like to be on the record talking about their brothers. But the hurricane felt that, well, they had, and this is no exaggeration, more than 10 confidential sources. They had seen photographs and social media postings, which they weren't allowed to keep, that were subsequently taken down. So there's no doubt that with that many sources, and it was more than 10, and it was an issue they considered of great public importance and public health. When you're in a student media organization, the community you're covering is rather close. Okay, it is. There are some pros and cons to that, and the confidential source question is always a difficult one, even in the world of professional journalism. You have handled that sort of question, and I think I don't know who wants to start. I'm looking to see who's muted and who's unmuted. Want to jump in with that?
Obviously, it's better to always have the sources, that are willing to speak, and in our world, in the television world, willing to go on camera, and in the online and print world, willing to be quoted. That's 1,000% better. But again, when we talk about this, it also goes again to the magnitude of the story. and what is the magnitude of the story and who is the confidential source. In the example I gave with Parkland, the person I had on the phone is a person who has all the authority to know the information. And I think that that's a big difference. If a parent called me and said that, I take that completely differently than the person who said that to me, although we could not use that individual's name and cite them, in the broadcast, but you know who you're talking to. And therefore, that makes a huge difference in whether or not we're going to feel comfortable with a confidential source, or at least on my end, how I take that information in, and also the relationship that you have with that person. And I think the relationships and building relationships is a constant daily thing that we all need to do. I want to stress that to our Kane students and students across the board. When there is a major event, everybody's calling, everybody wants to try to have access to information. The way you're able to move forward, do it ahead, get the information first and do things is by building relationships on a daily basis. So when something does transpire that everybody else is interested in, you're at the front of the line and everyone else is waiting. And so that's something that's very important that I want to try to get across today about this. And also in that case, many times, and it's a major event like that, the source will be confidential, but you have a relationship with them. You know who they are, you know what access they have information to, and you know what the relationship is that you built with them.
Miriam?
Sorry.
No. We're all so polite. I love this bunch. So I think, well, first, you have to get independent, sources. I do believe that, one person telling you something, is different. And like Willard says, I mean, if your confidential source is the sheriff of the police department and it's a police issue, I mean, it's a pretty good source. And think why they don't want to be named. That's one of the things when people say, oh, I'll talk to you, but I don't want my face showing because I'm embarrassed, is not good enough. If somebody's going to come after my family and want to kill me, I'm not going to show your face. That's an ethical question, right? If they're going to, if there's bodily harm, if there's retribution, if there's something like that. But I think it's important to look for independent sources. And when I think about this, it's, we had a really crazy story years ago about a veterinary clinic. The allegations that were things that were happening at that vet clinic were so outrageous, and they were coming from ex-employees. So you immediately, are these disgruntled ex-employees? These are some crazy allegations. So we did several things. We did some undercover work, and we also looked at other vets that had worked in that clinic who left in good standing. And we went and we spoke to them off camera, to confirm, like, what did you see in that clinic? Because they were so far-fetched, these allegations, that, it was hard for us to process. And that's how we were able to confirm with 10 different independent sources, people that weren't calling us to tell us the story, people that didn't even want to talk about this. They were like, listen, I don't want to talk about this. I left in good standing and I don't want to talk about this. To confirm those suspicions or those allegations, look for independent sources. And sometimes is, looking outside the people who are contacting you. So that's my recommendation. Look, who else can confirm this? That is not the people who are calling me. And also, why are these people calling me? That's a question you always have to ask. Why are they, what's in it for them? Why are they calling me? So those are questions that you have to ask, ethical questions in my regards.
And so taking a step back, when you use anonymous sources, you, the reporter, you still need to know who the person is. You need to know the person's name, you need the person's number, because you don't want to stumble upon a party at UM and say, hey, I met some guy and he said this is happening. Because you, the reporter, producer, you're responsible for knowing something about this person who's giving you this information. So the general rule of thumb is if the person's life or livelihood is in jeopardy, then you would consider using that information. using that tip. You always want to try to get people to go on the record. We had a story maybe 2 days ago about teachers in Dade County who were concerned about COVID safety situations. And I had to ask this. It was insulting to ask the reporter, you know the teacher's name, you know the situation. The reporter, I don't need to know the person's name. The reporter had it. The reporter had heard similar stories from a dozen people. So we felt comfortable using this person's voice on air. If you want to remain anonymous, I wonder why you want to let someone use their voice, but the guy was okay with it. So he used his voice. The story matched what at least a dozen other people said was a situation at the particular school. But you need to be sure of what it is. You need to be sure that the person has a legitimate reason for wanting to remain confidential, life, safety, or livelihood.
Sam, you're muted.
Sorry about that. Bob, do you want to sum up on that?
Just very quickly, I like very much the way Terrence described that case and the ones that Willard and Miriam have brought to the table. And what Terrence is talking about there is what has been called prosecuting the process of the story and the reporting. Some of you on this webinar this morning listening in are editors of your student newspapers or news directors of your television or radio stations, or your leaders in one way or another of your digital sites. And you should be prepared if one of your reporters wants to use a confidential source to ask the kind of questions that Terrence was suggesting there to prosecute the story. How do you know that? How many different sources do you have? Miriam talked about, are the sources independent from each other? In other words, do each of those sources have reliability without knowing what the other source is saying? That's very important as an editor, as a news director, to ask the hard questions before you make the determination of, in the rarer cases, you would use a confidential source. It is a tool of last resort, but in some cases, it's a necessary tool to use.
Well said. Gina, you've been gathering up the questions from our audience members. What would you like to toss at us?
Yes, I have. And what a fascinating conversation it's been so far this morning with this, what I would call the all-star ethical decision-making team. But we hear from Blake Schmaltz at University of Central Florida, and Blake writes, amid so many attacks on the credibility of journalists, how do you prove that your reporting is truthful and accurate? And we've talked about how we go about that business, but how do we convey that message to the public?
I think transparency is important. I think you can walk people through your process. And if you have only 2 minutes on the air, you can send them on your web and have your documents on them. I think that you can be transparent with how you got your stuff. Nowadays, we have so many platforms that, you know, if the news director tells you, listen, your story is too long on TV or on radio, you can send people to your web and you're like, we have the records on our website. You can go check them out. You can make things interactive and walk people. I usually show people how I find stuff. Say a picture that somebody was posting about a mansion for rent that turns out to be a scam. I show people, listen, we went into, Google image and popped in the picture, and it turns out it was a house in Fiji. It was in Miami. And we show the process. Sometimes you don't have that, but maybe you that kind of time to do on your story, but you can take it to another platform and show them the process there. And Lord knows the social media people will love you for that.
Agreed. If we have time for another one, Deborah Coffey, also from UCF, says protests have been going on in this country since May. Do you think there has been a lot of violation in the principles of journalism through the mainstream media?
In terms of the coverage of the protests?
I think that's what she meant. I think she's saying, does she think we've violated ethical standards in covering the protests in the manner in which they've been covered?
Panelists, one of the difficult things here is that you have mainstream media organizations that are clearly staffed by human beings, and humans, we all are flawed, we all make mistakes. But mainstream media organizations are trying to be accurate, truthful, fair. And then you have others who perhaps have an agenda, a political point of view, and they're there to advance that on behalf of what other cause. And sometimes when I hear the concern that people think that the media organizations are no longer objective, I don't know what they're really watching or listening to. How do we deal with that? What do you think?
Well, I'd actually and I wanted to ask Bob that question because, I'm heartbroken by what we've seen in our industry in a sense of on the broadcast side, people are looking at the television and they're not us. They're not, I don't believe, dissecting. And that kind of goes to the heart of the student's question. Is she referring to the journalist? Is she referring to the commentators? Or because of the blur that we have with this now, that no one is making that delineation. And therefore, how do we emphasize real reporting that we're doing? And we certainly don't want our work convoluted, mixed in with commentary, but it's not branded in that way. And so the average person watching this, it's not as much of a factor in the print world and on the online world, but for us, they don't delineate that difference. And I try to make it my point to watch all spectrums at the same time. I'm recording different things and watching different things. And you would think that we're living on different planets. And therefore, I'm really worried about that. And I want to ask Bob if there's an idea we have or a way or a thought to be able to convey that and make sure that there isn't this kind of confusion, because just by the way that question's worded, I'm not sure that that student has a delineation between what we're seeing from a commentary perspective and what we're seeing from a journalistic perspective.
You've framed it very well, Willard, in terms of that challenge. I do believe we have an obligation to tell the public what it is that we're doing. If we're doing reporting, if we're doing analysis based on our reporting, if on the other hand, we're doing commentary or opinion, we should be saying what that difference is and telling the public through some sort of verbal and on-screen labeling or in the newspaper of what it is. Also, I think the public has an obligation to learn more about it as well. I think this is a primary obligation of the journalist, but the public should be aware of it. I do want to mention two things that I think have contributed to the problem. One is the tendency of many in broadcast in talkbacks between the host or the anchor and the reporter in the field to start freelancing in terms of the commentary of what's going on without being prepared as to the real facts of the situation. When a host or an anchor asks a reporter in the field in the midst of a protest, what do you think is going on, or what's your opinion? That's headed into a minefield right away, because the reporter is very likely to stray away from straight reporting and offer an opinion. Secondly, while I think there's great value in social media, we can see many examples with tweeting or other forms of digital social media expression where the journalists are putting out an observation which becomes an opinion, and there is no check and balance. It doesn't go through any sort of editorial process, and therefore the view of the reporter moves from factual-based reporting to personal opinion as to what's going on. And again, you're in a minefield when you do that journalistically and ethically.
And people right now, their fact checking is on social media. They're going to go to your page and see what they find. And if your brand is you're a straight shooter and you put your information out there without a bias, they're just going to find stories on there. But if you're out there putting your opinion on social media, then that's what you're going to be labeled as. So people, that's their fact checking. They go back and they cross-reference you. Because right now, and as the news industry knows, a lot of people are consuming news at their time, online, whenever they want, on demand, for example. And so I think talking about, your brand is important. What you put out there is not only going to come back and haunt you later, because we've been scaring kids for the longest. Don't put stuff out there, then you're not going to get hired. It's not about not getting hired. And yeah, you probably won't get hired by some people, but some people might hire you and offer you a job because of what you wrote. But also, is it pushing your brand forward, or is it setting you back? I mean, and that's the kind of conversation you have to have only with yourself, like before you post something. And we're all tempted, because it is right now it's really tough to not, respond to somebody saying something. But is that going to push your brand forward, or is it going to make you, be singled out as somebody who is biased, who has their bias? And so, Willard wrote this, so when he reported on that, he really meant this. And that's one of the things that, especially now with the way the industry is going and the way people are consuming news, is something you have to watch out for. Aside from, I love what Bob said, that chit chat that they call it, that's what they call it in TV. Oh, chit chat a little, make it longer, we have some time. Oh, the video's great, stay on it. That chit chat is where you get in trouble. I'm one of those people that'll send a suggested anchor intro to make sure that there is nothing on there that could be misconstrued.
I
want to follow
say
up.
that,
Go ahead, Terrence, go ahead.
that a serious consumer of news will take the time to understand that what Willard reported is true, it's accurate, because Willard has taken the time to build a relationship with the audience. So it's, Sammy said it's not just up to us, it's also up to consumers to take this seriously and go a little bit deeper. That's all I'm going to be able to say.
I want to follow on that and what Miriam said about the social media, because many of our students watching this, that's a primary platform of communication for them, and we obviously use it. I have a simple rule that I put on the social media what I'm going to put on the broadcast. If it doesn't meet those standards, I don't put it on there, except for two exceptions. My German Shepherd and my son, who's in the Marines, and a picture of him in his uniform. But outside of that, if you never know, as Miriam mentioned, down the road where you're at an event, you're at a birthday party, someone could have on a t-shirt, something, whatever, and I just don't think it's worth it. Does it mean that I lose some followers or some of those things and some likes? Yes, but it protects me from ever having a problem with something that was posted.
Well said.
The question is, do you want to be popular among your friends, or do you want to be seen as a credible, serious journalist?
Well said. Gina, what's our next question?
Well, to follow along with that, we have Rick Brunson from University of Central Florida, who wants to know if we should engage with people who have commentary on our stories on social media. Should we engage with them in arguments? I think I know the answer, but let you answer it.
I don't want to prejudice the discussion, because we'll start with Miriam.
Well, here's the thing. If you don't engage, then you look like you're ignoring them. I would definitely not be removing posts from people, but I would definitely not start arguments with people. You can always bring it back to your story. Say they had an issue with the story, or last night we were talking with one of my consumer friends, and she's like, you do one story to help somebody and 10 people write, well, you didn't help me with that issue. And you can't start fighting, but you could say, hey, send me your information and I'll get to you and actually follow through. So social media is good, because I think communicating, that's the way people are reaching out to you. But you can't start arguments with people. Like Willard says, if you wouldn't put it on TV, don't answer like that. If you wouldn't talk to your mom like that, don't answer like that. Because as you know, I just did a story like a month ago. What you put on social media, there was actually a gentleman who had a private chat with somebody, and then they screenshot that and tagged their company on Twitter with that post, and it was a private conversation, and the guy got fired by that. It was this big dilemma, and the issue is, right now, all of that can come back to haunt you. So I would definitely not start an argument. If it's going array, you can bring it back to your story and the facts. I think that it's important to put your facts in there. If somebody's saying something that was wrong, that is not accurate, you can point out the facts, and you can, attach a document on there. I know it sounds nerdy, but say, look, or here's a link to those numbers posted by this agency, so you can check them out yourself. You can redirect the conversation without arguing with people. I think that that's important. There's no need to argue.
I would add, this is another situation where Bob's suggestion, echoed by others, that you have a conversation with people around you can often be very helpful. So before you respond in anger to that troll, and the definition of a troll might vary from person to person, you might want to have a conversation or two, because you won't make it. You won't make it any better. You really won't. What else do you have, Gina?
Okay, we have Nate Marrero, I'm not sure I pronounced that correctly, from the University of Central Florida. And he wants to know, what's your advice on dealing with people who can be hostile or difficult during an interview?
Interviewing techniques with the, and I would imagine Willard has probably encountered a few of those at various times in his career. What do you think, Willard?
Well, I have a rule that cuts across the board, and that is I treat people the way that I would want to be treated. And if I go do one story with a person, no matter how negative it may be about that person, I always want to be able to go back. So I say that cuts across the board with the gathering of the information, with the things Terrence talked about giving somebody a fair amount of time to respond, all of these things. And that includes the interview. So if there's a person, and you use the word hostile there, that generally means that person's not going to come and sit down and stop to take the time to interview because they don't want to talk to you. Mm-hmm. So therefore, if you need to approach them, and you approach them in a public area and public environment, and you just simply treat them with respect when you're answering or asking them questions. And if they don't answer, you continue to ask questions in a respectful manner, and let their silence, if that's what it is, become the evidence itself, and let people at home be able to see what has actually transpired. I think in terms of treating people that way, an individual at home that sees that, you're not gaining any brownie points yelling at people, harassing people, if you want to use that word. And especially in the times we're living in, I think that goes into what some people negatively think about us. And if you've done your research, and you would never go do one of those interviews until you've had everything in your back pocket. You don't ask a question you don't already know the answer to. And therefore, the silence that you're probably going to receive really will resonate a tremendous amount. And that's the way that I believe in handling those, and they can walk on off their way, but the point has been made.
I think also the silence is important during an interview process in general. Sometimes people feel like they have to ask these really long questions. And sometimes when you're quiet, people will talk to you. So during interviews, be quiet and let them talk. And the other two issues that I think are related to this are ambush interviews and attribution. I think, first of all, ambush interviews are when you don't let this person know you're coming. We don't do ambush interviews at NBC. If you ever see us catch up to somebody, and in my case, out of breath and out of shape, it's because we've called them, we've emailed them, we've sent them to, I've dropped off my card, and they still haven't, responded. And then we have to meet them in a public place, like Willard says, and catch up to them. And then when we frame the questions, when we do catch up to them, first, like Willard said, be very prepared with all your background information. They already know what you're looking for. You're not ambushing them because they know, because you try to ask them these questions via email, text, phone, smoke signals, whatever you did. And you're not going to get that, oh, shock reaction, but you're going to get a better answer. You're going to get a more prepared answer. And you attribute. I've seen so many times, seasoned reporters out in the field say, why did you do this? And, that goes against everything that you are taught right now in school. You have to attribute, so-and-so says that you did this, what is your response? You attribute, or these documents, obtained by whatever, say, and you bring your little documents, say this and this and this, what's your response to that? And it's the way you attribute those questions that'll make you look either fair or, like a crazy person.
Bob, on this issue, is it different for people in broadcasting where I would imagine as Miriam's running after that guy, the camera's rolling. Broadcasters are in a somewhat different position as compared to, say, print, which, there might be a photographer present, but there might not be either. Are there different strategies for handling these hostile interviews?
Well, anytime you have a camera involved, it changes the dynamic. I would say that it's very important to not go in with preordained ideas in those situations, even if somebody has not responded to you despite your multiple queries, to give them the opportunity, if you then challenge them in a public place, to do it. I think with newspaper journalists or a digital journalist, or if in rare cases a television journalist without a camera, assume for your own purposes of fairness that everything you are doing is being recorded and presented to the public, so that you set the bar very high for your behavior, for your professional practice in that situation. Assume that whatever you do in your modus operandi and your methods of going about your interview is going to be revealed to the public. I think that is a standard that requires us then to be at the top of our game ethically and journalistically.
Good point.
Yeah, and excuse me, Sam, Bob, follow on that. And in terms of when you talked about the camera rolling and everything there being on the record, just this week during our vice presidential debate, our current vice president basically alleged that not only Ms. Harris, but those of us in the media many times do what he calls selective editing, and that extracting certain things taken out of context. And therefore, we have a huge number of rules at NBC about that. But that's something we have to be very, very, very careful about, so that we have everything within its context, even if we can't put all of it in, but that it is certainly in context, because to do something outside of that is unethical and unfair.
Well said. Gina, I think I'm getting signaled we're going to have to wrap up fairly soon, but I think we have time for one more quick question from our audience. You're muted, Gina.
Grant Wheeler from the University of Central Florida wants to know, how do you continue to conduct the interview if the interviewee is not being cooperative? And I think we may have addressed that somewhat. Does anybody have anything to add?
We don't engage in torture. Though I'm sure I've had reporters tempted at different times. Anybody want to jump in on that?
Good journalists always ask the question near the end of an interview, no matter how it's gone, is there anything else that you want to say to me at this time about this issue, about what you've said, to clarify, to expand?
And then one last one, Jessica Gray from Florida State University says, is there information about your assignments that you cannot discuss with the public? And how do you remain neutral in your reporting? $64,000 question.
Well, And I would assume, and I invite the panelists to jump in, yes, there are always some things, some parts of the editorial process that ought not be discussed publicly. That's the lawyer in me, I think, coming out. But again, for me, it takes it back to something several people, including Bob, have mentioned. You need to have a conversation internally in your news organization about your policies, your standards, and how to handle this so that you know going in, because what works at one organization might not work at another. Would anyone like to jump in and expand on that?
I think the decision making is important. There are a lot of ethical decisions that we make behind, before a story. And first, I don't know that would derail a story. If you're explaining why you did or didn't include something, that's going to derail your story. It's going to become its own story. But I think that part should, there's no need to be showing, all your editorial decisions. For example, a recording made by somebody without the consent of somebody else, it was provided to us. They violated the law by making that recording, but it is so crucial, it's so important that, we are going to air this, after running through our standards, we're going to air that recording. I can, in good conscience, for example, not tell that person, and this is an ethical dilemma, tell that person, listen, if we air, you broke the law. If we air this story, they can go after you. And that's an ethical question. I'm not going to include that in a story because then it's like, oh, the guy broke the law recording. I mean, I think that's not what the story is about. But I think those decisions, by putting him into a story, it kind of takes the story a whole different direction. So I think ethical decisions that we make, unless necessary, don't really need to be included in a story.
Yeah, it's important to treat people with dignity and respect, but you need to remember that your ultimate audience is the people you're doing the story for, not necessarily the subject you're interviewing. So keep in mind, keep laser focused on the goal of the story you want, the backstory, how you came about it. It's generally not relevant to anyone you're interviewing.
I want to thank all of the viewers for their excellent questions. They've been terrific and just more evidence of the fact that we could probably go on for several hours more. Good news is we're not. You can go have lunch. I'd like to invite the panelists to maybe conclude, with a minute or two about any general thoughts on the ethical issues facing journalists today. And again, we'll start with Miriam.
There we go, unmuting myself. Well, thank you so much. I really enjoy this. I love it because I get to learn from you guys and also from the young students, our future journalists or our current journalists. They're just young and in another medium right now. I think that, like I said, ethics for me is about being fair and also responsible. And I'm going to close out with a story about a case that I have yet to be able to do that has been haunting me for 15 years, which is a story about people taking advantage of undocumented people, offering them fake driver's license. I was in New York years ago working, and they were basically charging these undocumented people thousands of dollars for a driver's license. They said they were going to get them in North Carolina. They would take their money, drive to North Carolina, drop them off there and leave them there. And it was a horrible story. And we had the interviews. And one of the DAs there in New York said, we can do an undercover. And, we could stop the bus. We can put a person in the bus as it's going by and then stop it a little bit later. And I said, well, what about all the other people that are in the bus, the other undocumented people? Would you be able to signal them or say something? Like, no, but we wouldn't prosecute them. And I said, well, if you ask them for a license and they show you a fake ID, he goes, then we would have to arrest them and deport him. And the ethical dilemma was, if I, participated in this, the benefit would be getting the story out, which we ended up getting either way with the testimony of those who had been scammed. But we couldn't go through with the DA because I couldn't, in myself, in my conscience, allow a story that we are working on to have all those people arrested and victimize other people. So I think that when you are moving forward as a journalist, you should always look at 5 steps ahead. What's going to happen when this story airs or while I am doing this story? And what is the impact it's going to have to the people involved, the community at large? And those are the ethical questions you have to, present to yourself before. And like Willard and Bob and Terrence said, talk to people around you. Don't make these decisions by yourself. Nobody is a one-man show. You need a village. Just like you need a village to raise kids, you need a village to be a journalist. You need to surround yourself by amazing journalists, by interns, by everybody that can give you their opinion and help you make a good decision. So that's my 2 cents.
Thanks, Miriam. Terrence, what would you like to say to conclude?
In conclusion, congratulations on choosing this as your career path, because more than ever, we need good, solid journalists in order to have a functioning democracy. So thank you for doing this. Keep up the good work. Pick out a role model, pick out a mentor, pick out someone who you really admire and pay close attention to the ethical decisions they make. You can probably game out what they could have done that wasn't ethical. Just think through who your audience is. Do you want to be a hero to your audience, to the community at large, or do you want to be a hero on social media? And always remember, facts, truth, fairness, context, and accuracy, those are all your friends. Everyone has an opinion. There are sayings about that, but stick with those 5 points and you'll do fine.
Thanks, Terrence. Willard?
Well, the journalist in me is remiss if I don't ask Terrence, is that your handiwork there behind you? Miriam talked about a village. That's an impressive piece of artwork. So I need to know a little more about that.
Picked it up, bought it in Haiti.
Beautiful. Very nice.
It is a village.
Right.
Yeah, it is.
Right
Great.
to the village. Okay, great. Hey, I want our students to know, and all of us to know, this is the most critical time for us in this business, certainly in my career, and that the road you're about to travel is a very, very, very important one, 1000%. And that we are now living in a time where the stories and the things that we do matter, and they matter in a person's daily life. Miriam trying to save people money, the things we hear on the radio with about our schools, or whether or not you're going to send your kids to school with Terrence, the things that we do about our health, about how you're going to vote. There's never been a more important time to enter into this profession and this trade work. And that if you do the following, A, you treat every single day journalistically, ethically, and legally doing the right thing, and treat people the way you would want to be treated, you will have nothing but success and follow a great path to be able to give people communication and information that families really need. And you don't think about it, but what we tell people a lot of times, especially now, people actually do. And there's very few things in life that have that power, and you need to take that seriously. And I appreciate the chapter doing this and everybody participating. And I'm sure that our ratings will be higher than the Canes when they hit the field at 7:30 tonight.
Oh. Bob, you get the last word.
Well, I want to give my appreciation to you, Sam, and to Gina and your colleagues at the University of Miami, and professors at University of Central Florida, Florida State, and other colleges in the region, and others who might be tuning in from anywhere, particularly to high school newspaper advisors who have a very challenging role and a very important role. And also very much to the high school journalists and college journalists who are tuning in today, because as the others have said, what you're doing is exceptionally important. my congratulations to Miriam and Terrence and Willard on your great careers. And I think each of you provide terrific role models for the journalists of the next generation, who I hope will be joining you, many of these students tuning in today, in the newsrooms in Florida and across the country and around the world. What you do in journalism, you are certainly not enemies of the people. You are servants of the public and the public good. Onward, my friends, onward.
Terrific note on which to conclude. I want to thank the panelists, everyone at Suncoast, for making my job very, very easy. I know there are people who would like contact information for the panelists, and that you should go to the Suncoast website. There is an email that will be posted for additional information. And with that, I will turn it over to Sarah to wrap up the proceedings.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Sam, Miriam, Willard, Terrence, Bob. This was awesome. This, like we were saying before, this is the first of many for our webinar series. So thank you. We're so grateful that all of you took the time this morning. This is a really important topic, and we really appreciate your expertise on it. I also want to take time to thank the Student Production Awards Committee, our incredible production team, and then the Suncoast Board of Governors for their incredible support, countless hours behind the scenes for making the dream of this series a reality. This has been months of work, so we're very excited to continue these monthly. Thank you to the teachers, advisors, and administrators for encouraging your students to participate. And last but not least, I want to thank you, our students, and our future journalists. Thank you for joining us this morning. Again, we want to continue these conversations. We're going to be doing these webinars monthly, and we'll see what happens and where they evolve and what they turn into. But we really just want to find ways to give back to you, our students. So like Sam was saying, you could go onto our website, suncoastchapter.org, for more information, and we'll be continuing to post the future webinar information on there. Our next topic is going to be reporting during unprecedented times, and that'll be our November topic. So we're really excited, and we, again, would encourage you to give us feedback. And thank you, everyone, for joining us this morning. It's been great.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thanks, Suncoast. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
It's been an honor.
Bye.
Bye. Go Canes.
Thank you.
Farewell, friends.
Thank you.